Hello and welcome to CMT Economics. I'm Derek Van Gorder. This is the show all about basic income and your questions about basic income. I'm actually feeling a little bit under the weather today, so instead of camera and lights, this will be an audio only episode. I hope that's all right. Joining me here in the Discord chat is Eddie Chu. He's going to talk with me about some of the other people's questions that have come up in the chat, in the Discord, and on Twitter. And to get started here, we're just going to take a look at the news. The most exciting piece of basic income news I think that came out recently was that starting April 28th, there's going to be a basic income fair in South Korea in the province of Gyeonggi, I think it's pronounced. I'm not sure. And that's apparently become a bit of a hotspot for basic income research. So there's going to be a really long conference. There's a lot of speakers, a lot of different people speaking, but the names that we might recognize that we've actually talked about before would be Philip van Praij and Guy Standing of the Basic Income Earth Network Project, and also Almaz Zelki, who spoke on, we had the pleasure of speaking with her on one of Boston Basic Income episodes. So that will be very interesting. I'm looking forward to seeing what comes out of that. They're apparently going to be going over a lot of the basic income uh, research tests and pilot projects that have been going and trying to talk about what lessons they can draw from that. So I'm very much looking forward to seeing what are the big takeaways. Eddie, have you heard of this? Did you know that this was going on? Stand by 1 second because I don't think the your audio is coming through on the stream. Give me 2 seconds and I'll fix that.
Can you
Okay,
hear me
that
now?
that should do it. Yeah. Okay, we can hear you now.
Yep. So I have read articles about some of the UBI experiments that they're doing in South Korea, and that's very exciting.
Yeah, that's going to be nice. The next piece, there's a lot of the same stuff that's been going on. There's different experiments doing people, comments about that. But one article that was interesting was about the stimulus checks. This was Bloomberg published this. Let me see if I can pull it up. It's called "Big Banks Rake in Record Profits as Stimulus Props Up Consumers." And this was, I think, very interesting based on the kind of stuff we talk about. Let me pull it up here on the stream.
Yep.
For your benefit, Eddie, I'm going to read through some of the rhetoric here. So we have, okay, the U.S. government piled trillions of dollars of emergency funds into Americans' accounts during the pandemic. That's boosting the bottom lines of the banks that store their cash. Lending giants reported blockbuster profits this week, in part because stimulus payments have helped consumers bounce back from the COVID-19 crisis and prevented more severe economic damage. The emergency funds helped boost deposits at the four biggest U.S. banks to 6.9 trillion last quarter, up 15% from a year earlier. The resilience of consumers, thanks in part to those stimulus checks, also prompted the four lenders to reduce the amount they'd set aside for soured loans by 12.7 billion. So it goes into a bit of detail here, but the gist of it is that people were predicting actually much worse effects, right,
Yeah.
on businesses from the pandemic, and so they put aside a lot of money and assets, and they were preparing for the worst. And then it turns out it wasn't as bad as they thought. Why? Well, because of these massive stimulus expenditures that went out. So it's really interesting that this doesn't really talk about, this article is a business article. It doesn't talk about like how this is helping, poor people or something. It's purely about how the economy is doing well and how these banks are doing well. But it's interesting, right? If you're helping people, if you're giving people money, it seems to work out pretty well for everybody else. So it makes me think about like, well, okay, why didn't we do this before the pandemic? Why isn't this kind of normally what we want to occur for, not that we want banks to make all this profit or businesses to make a lot of profit, but it's like if they're in the business of serving our needs, right? Why shouldn't we always want this machine to be turning over? So that's it's this was, I don't know, I just found this to be an interesting article.
Yeah, absolutely. If the bottom does well, all the businesses, that are based on consumers, which is all of them, do well also. And I think it's another thing that is good about what happened is that when you talk about the stimulus payments, allowing debt to reduce a little bit, that's definitely one of the things that we expect to happen. Like Jeff Crocker talks about, we are currently sort of holding up consumer spending and the economy with debt, and it would be a good thing to replace a great deal of that debt with money, actually.
Right. Here's a quote to that effect. So it said, okay, um, they set aside these billions of dollars because they were predicting, under the expectation that Americans would be so economically devastated by the pandemic that they'd stop paying their credit card bills and other loans in droves. But that calamity never came to pass. And instead, quote, this is the healthiest we have seen the consumer emerge from a crisis in recent history, driven in large part by the U.S. government stimulus package. Citigroup's new chief executive officer, Jane Fraser, told analysts on an earnings conference call. So that's kind of funny when you think about it, right? This is supposed to be a huge crisis. And obviously, it was a huge crisis, a health crisis in many ways. But to some extent, they're saying the consumers are doing, as much better than they typically have, right, in the past. And that's strange. I think a lot of people would be puzzled. Why is it that when there's sort of, people were concerned about records unemployment and loss of businesses and all this stuff, how could it be that we could come out of that with increased consumer spending? And that would seem sort of crazy to most people. But if you think it does make sense if you take the CMT view that says that, well, before the crisis, we were operating probably operating way underneath our actual consumer capacity, right? And I don't think most people are thinking that, we're just using these crises as an excuse to put in the consumer spending that we normally need.
Yeah, I think in some like sort of weird sense, there is some like a silver lining to the cloud, where you have this
Right.
crisis which is bad, but then it spurs government to actually take some actions which they would not normally, and those actions have had a really good effect. So there, it is a sort of a bit of a silver lining to a bad thing, to a bad situation.
It's funny because you and I were talking about this basic income stuff and having these similar meetings and everything before the pandemic hit. And so it was
Yeah.
really interesting. It was one thing to be kind of arguing in favor of this stuff conceptually and being like, "Hey, this would be a great idea," kind of like the early Andrew Yang days. And I remember the political landscape and the rhetorical landscape then. It's very different when now we sort of have this case in point. It is sort of tragic that it took that, and I hate
Yeah.
to I hate to sort of be using the pandemic in that sense, but it does seem that the perception has now changed. It's now obvious that this is possible, that this is an ongoing thing. We can put in this money, and now we just have to sort of connect. The struggle now is connecting that to normal times, because I'm not sure of is that once this crisis goes away, that will fully internalize the lessons from it, right? We may just go back to, well, okay, that was necessary during the emergency, but in normal times we have to, we have to go back to business as usual.
Yeah, that's the big question that government and everybody has to answer. I like to study history, and I think that the Great Depression period is analogous to this current era. And one of the ways is that the economics of the situation, um, due to the domination of productivity growth, actually, continues downwards until it reaches the point where it is so bad that government is just forced to do something, and that change in politics eventually we find something we do things that help the consumer worker, help the people, the bottom 50%, and that actually ends up bringing us out of sort of the the bad economic dynamic that we're in.
And
That's how I
yeah,
see it.
the funny thing is that when that occurs successfully, and what I suspect happens, and I think at least Alex's his wording of things tends to suggest this too, is that people will sort of take it for granted. Not that that's a bad thing, but the goal is to make it normal, right? So if you think about like the Great Depression, that was not normal according to most people, and it was this horrible thing that occurred, and then we had to come up with this policy to deal with it. But then after we sort of found a way to more reliably guarantee higher employment, that just became the expectation. And then we forget that there's even a policy constantly running that's ensuring that. And we just sort of go, oh, well, this is normal. we're all reasonably full employed, and then the
Yeah.
conversation becomes about how do we get it even more from here, right? So if you were looking at employment figures back in the Great Depression and you looked at the debates people were having now, where it's like, can we get another 1% or 2% out of it, right, out of the system? They'd be like, that's crazy. You guys are living in prosperity land. So I think it'll be kind of that way. The challenge is to get there with basic income, to get to the point where people will feel like getting these stimulus checks, quote unquote, is normal and it's an ordinary thing. I don't know. Yeah, I'm still finding a lot of resistance on that front. I still don't think that people are really ready to accept that it's normal for that to occur.
Yeah. I mean, I think absolutely that is what happens, and to some degree, to some degree, a lot of society just kind of moves on and says, "Okay, this is normal now." They don't think too deeply on it. But I think one of the aspects of it is, during the Great Depression, you do have figures like Keynes, and he's talking about during that time, it was normal to balance the budgets whenever we were not in a time of war. And there was resistance to not balancing the budget. And, he was arguing for, from an economics standpoint, why this is actually necessary, why it's a good thing. And that was the period when Keynesianism, sort of became very mainstream in economic thought.
Right.
So, it is a bit of an analogous situation. So hopefully, maybe, CMT and these ideas about why we need a UBI economics, can get a little bit of, sort of progress, in this
Yeah.
time,
Yeah, I think
hopefully.
I think that'll be the interesting question when we look back from the future, who will be referred to and what body of ideas will be referred to as kind of the new base. And I found my
Yeah,
way here because I was looking for that. I'm like, okay, well, what's that new paradigm, the new, not someone who's going to build on and maybe even replace some aspects of that kind of Keynesian framework that which people are looking at the economy through. And it's, I'm making this long bet on CMT, which a lot of people haven't heard of yet. I want more people to hear about it, but it's not inevitable or obvious that this will be what becomes that. We could, for all we know, go through a period where maybe it's MMT, right? Maybe Stephanie Kelton's, those ideas kind of become the new framework. And that would be, in some sense, very different from the previous paradigm, but it would be similar
yeah,
in that they'd both be trying to maximize employment, right? So this new power of deficit spending and cash infusion, they would adopt that into the model, but they wouldn't change the more fundamental thing, which is the question of what's the difference between, maximizing benefit to consumers or maximizing benefit to employment, to workers. And
right.
so that's the tricky thing. And I guess I am well, the reason I'm doing this is because I'm worried that we won't make that next jump. We'll actually have to go through a period where are still we're still increasing employment instead of reducing poverty directly.
Right, right. As you know, I've got my own set of ideas that I'm
Right.
calling theory, and it has a lot of overlap with consumer monetary theory. I'd say 90%, of what we're saying
Yeah.
is pretty the same. And then you have MMT, which is very popular, and I'm also supporting and hoping for I think that's CMT or CCT has the right ideas. I don't think MMT can be successful at solving the problems because I don't think their framework of understanding is actually quite right.
Well,
Um,
what's
yeah,
interesting though is that I think that people's um, in some sense, I think the what MMT can kind of take credit for, and the reason why they're so successful is they're successful on this one point, on the important point that they have in common with CMT, on this idea that the deficit spending isn't, that's itself is not a problem. That should be a normal policy tool that we try to get the most benefit out of. That seems to strike a chord with people, and I noticed I don't think that people. I think that they've got a lot more reach just on that point than the stuff about the FJG and the other stuff about
right.
taxation driving the currency. I just talked to a friend who's not an economist, someone from my film days, and he's heard of the stuff I'm doing here, and he was talking about MMT. He's like, oh yeah, well, like MMT and basic income, like that's the whole idea, right? I had to tell him like, no, well, that's actually not what MMT. They don't like the basic income stuff. So for a lot of people, they actually really, when they first hear about the MMT idea of, in their mind, the
Yeah.
MMT idea of not deficit spending, they just immediately go, yeah, and then you just combine it with engineering. Like it seems like an easy logical step, and I find a lot of people are actually confused when you tell them, actually, no, MMT does not like basic income very much at all. So I think that might be good news for us, right?
That,
Because it means that
yeah.
even if we go into an MMT framework formally, that basic income for most people is still going to be an important policy option, and that's what matters.
I think a lot of the MMT like higher ups are are going to be resisting that. I think it's interesting that you said that CMT is focused on the distinction between helping people as consumers versus helping them as workers. From CCT, I think one of the really big distinctions and between what MMT is thinking and wanting to do is that you have to distinguish between putting money into the economy and thinking of it as a monolith and just saying, you can do this, or MMT kind of sort of wants to kind of put it in through the government. But but CCT says the big distinction is whether the money is going to the top or to the bottom. And right now we have a great deal going to the top. It's not very effective, and it's also having negative side effects. And you really need to put it into the bottom. And it actually doesn't even matter to CCT whether the net, like on net, you're putting a little bit of money into the economy total, or if you're taking a little bit out of the economy, like either is okay, as long as you get enough to the bottom instead of the top, then that works for CCT.
Right. And I think, and we largely agree with that. We don't usually use the language of bottom and the top because I think for us, it's important that the basic income is
Yeah,
sort of the default. It goes to everyone, and we emphasize that. But it is true that that's primarily who benefits from it, the basic income, right? And
yeah.
that's who we need it to go. We need to go to be spent by people who are poorer to start with, so that that spending can reduce their poverty, can make them richer. So I think that's a perfectly legitimate way of looking at it. Um,
Yeah.
so I'm gonna bring up some of these. I prepared these questions from last time. We only got to one of them last time, so let's. I wanted to go through at least a few more of them because that's what I really want the show to be about, is the questions people send
Cool.
in. But was there, before I
Awesome.
do that, were there any final points you wanted to get to?
No, let's do that.
Let's give it a shot. Okay. And just
Yeah.
as a reminder to anyone listening, at any time, feel free to, you can type in questions on the chat, or you can look me up on Twitter. There's a lot of ways to send in the questions. You can also post them here in the Discord channel, and then I'll be happy to get to them either right away or during the next show. So the first one, we'll just go over this again. We kind of went on a digression on this last one, so I'll just briefly mention it again. But Phoenix Congress was asking if economic output always requires employment, and I think there's some debate about, like, it depends on what you count as employment. But I think the important thing to emphasize was just that, like, people contributing to the economy, contributing, their work, their time, their resources, that's important, right? And you're never going to say that we don't need that entirely, unless you're imagining a really dramatic science fiction scenario in the future where robots are doing literally all of the work. And I think that's fine as a thought experiment, but in practice, in the real world, I think, at least for the foreseeable future, we've got to be clear that basic income is working alongside wages, right? It's not
Yeah.
replacing them. We have both of them, and I think that's just the only point I would want to reiterate about that
So
question.
yeah, I really agree with what Alex said. What I think Alex would say about this, and I'm gonna butcher it. I'm not gonna say it as well as he does, but he says something like, "What we really care about is the economic output." So if the economic output requires labor, then that's fine, and if it doesn't require labor, that's also fine. And we do want the output, whether or to what degree we have labor in it or not.
Right.
Um, and that's one aspect of the question. There's another aspect of the question, like, does economic output necessarily need labor, like on sort of on a descriptive level? And I would say, like, where we're currently at, there's definitely, if you increase economic output, there will definitely be an increase in the labor that is needed to generate that. um, but in the long run, in a longer run sense, productivity growth is going to slowly decrease um, the relative contribution of labor to output, if that makes sense. On a relative basis, like how much percent, um, how the relative contribution of labor is going to be in the long run decreased by productivity growth, and that's part of why it's very important to have a basic income to allow that to happen. Because if you're trying to get all the money to consumers through jobs instead, then that does sort of create um, problems. There are like bottlenecks in that system.
I think it's kind of a funny question because, when you mention basic income to people, it's so funny how people often go to, oh, well, do we, will robots do all the work? Like, do we not need work? And it's funny because uh, we don't have any basic income today, right? Basic income is at zero. And so the question is not like there surely should be something that we can imagine in between everybody doing as much work as possible and then machines getting allowing less of us to do as much work, right? And people just don't seem to be
Yeah,
comfortable with moving the needle at all, just a little bit away from everybody works all the time, to some people are working some of the time. And it's not, it's funny how there's this in our imagination, it's almost like there's this light switch we're going to turn on or off. And no one's thinking
yeah,
that, like, oh, well, can't we just work a little bit less? Can't we make everybody a little bit more prosperous unconditionally because of the technology that we have? So just getting that
yeah,
gradation is
yeah.
important.
Yeah, it's so important to answer that question on a nuanced basis, and you have to consider degree, like you're talking about, and you also have to consider time. Like, are we talking about right now, 10 years in the future, 50 years, 100 years? There's an entire picture around that, and I think that, and you know what, a lot of people who oppose UBI initially, a lot of times they will like sort of see it in black and white and say, "Oh, you're going to give everybody $1,000 and then you're going to have everybody stop working."
Right.
Well, no, no, no. Nobody said we're not going to outlaw working here. People are going to work to the degree that they need to, and the economic system needs them to. All you're doing is adding, money into basic into the to the consumer through basic income, which will actually increase spending. And I think that in the long run that we do eventually get to that stage, but the way it occurs does not have any of that sort of objection to it, because you're not trying to force people not to work. Productivity growth is also giving people trouble, is already giving people trouble finding valuable jobs to do, and what you're doing is putting the income that's needed, and eventually, I think it will be similar to the way when one individual becomes eventually prosperous enough that they don't have to work a job that they don't want to. And you look at how that happens, I think eventually the whole of society can also get to that stage. Maybe it's in 20
Right.
years,
Right.
where we're so prosperous that people do have, labor incomes are high enough, and basic income is high enough, and people are just not stressed. Like everybody makes on average 100,000, and then some people are like, you know what, that's plenty. I'm gonna spend half my time doing art or making music or whatever.
Right. You still when in basic income world, you still have wages and profits doing the same thing they do today. It's the same basic thing, and all we're doing is we're
Yeah,
making the higher the basic income can get, the more voluntary work becomes. The more flexibility you get in making those kind of choices about how you interact with the labor market, which is very much like how a lot of moderately wealthy and rich people today are already living, right? If you happen to come from
yeah,
a lot of wealth and you're lucky enough, well, then you experienced this already. But most of them, still do find work, right? Because people like to get additional sources of income. So it's just it's a question of how much more flexibility we're allowing ourselves, and that depends not on just a guess that we make. It depends on how productive are we? How efficient have all of this has all of this technology and businesses become? That's what allows us to put up the basic income higher. So let's I'm going to move
Yeah.
to the next question here.
I
Uh,
think a lot of times people get bored.
yeah, well, there's also that
They
people
still
come
have
up
to
with
work.
projects just because they're bored, and I think people underestimate the extent to which a lot of really successful contributions, both in the private and and the public and even in the scientific and academic sectors, a lot of the really good stuff there starts as just like people being curious about something and being bored and spending some hobby time, right? And then later people come along and go, oh, let's invest in this, let's make this bigger, right? Um,
Yeah.
Here was an interesting one from the Discord. So TFFE Tiffy, or I don't know how he pronounces that, but his question was, but with calibrated basic income, I worry about the calibrated amount always accommodating savings by billionaires, trillionaires, profiting from these industries. The CBI would continuously increase to fill that aggregate demand space and thereby lead to insane runaway inequality, which would need extremely ironclad or impossible money and politics protections. I have my ideas for how to solve this, but curious your thoughts on this concern. So we actually had a long chat in the Discord about this, and it was a very good conversation. But I wanted to bring this up on the show. I'm curious to hear your response to this, but my general response would be this is a very, very typical kind of CMT answer is to separate the problems of inequality and poverty and to emphasize that what the basic income is doing is solving the poverty part. And I think it's generally true in the economy that the more you give money to people, right? The more they're going to spend and the more of it gets collected. But that's not something new that a basic income or a calibrated basic income adds. That's true today. We are filtering money inefficiently to people through wages. We're filtering more and more money to people inefficiently through wages over time. So we can grow the spending in that way. And as that occurs, well, we see what we see. We see someone collecting a lot of that money because if it gets spent, someone has to collect it, right? It's going to be collected by businesses and people that are good at collecting money. And that's true either way. It's kind of a constant. And if you're really concerned about the collection of too much money on one end, you have to come up with some policies for that. So that would be, typically progressive income taxation. That's what addresses that problem if you're concerned about inequality. But if you're concerned about poverty, which is people not having enough money to spend, that's what the basic income does. So we would think it's pretty predictable that some level of, if money spending is increasing, money accumulation is almost certainly going to increase as well. And if you want to deal with that, we can deal with that with other tools, but it doesn't mean we should just keep everybody poor. It doesn't make sense. That's not a good way to reduce inequality is to just keep everybody poor.
Yeah. If you look at the US, coming out of the Great Depression and you look at wealth inequality, um, the last time something like this happened and we got FDR and we got a lot of progressive economic reform and came out of it, the wealth inequality, went down and it went down, for the next 40 years until you get to the 1970s or 80s until the rise of, neoliberalism, I guess. Um,
So you're making a prediction. Do you think that will happen again if we do a
Yeah,
CBI?
I do think it'll happen, and I think I think that's what matters. The wealth inequality is what matters, and by helping out the bottom, that will absolutely go down. To the degree that like rich people are sort of making a lot of money. If you think about it, so the reason I think that is what matters is if you think about it, money itself is not sort of important. If you took the US dollar and you added like six zeros on the front of it, and you took everybody's bank account and added six zeros on the top of it, the next day, like all the stores would just put six zeros on the prices, and nothing would change. Absolutely nothing would change. It doesn't matter, whether people are billionaires or not, but it does matter. Like wealth inequality, like what is the distribution, and you do need
Hmm.
a relatively equal distribution. You do need enough income at the bottom of society relative to the entire economy, for the economy to work in a healthy way.
Well, let me see if there's a distinction I can get you to agree with here, because I think we have a little bit of a disagreement about this. But let me see if I can get you to agree with this. So, I think if you're talking about income inequality, and if you're talking about highly unequal access to goods and services, those I think can be
Mhm.
separated in a really important way because um, we already know, right, that the wealthy who are amassing lots and lots and lots of all this income, adding those extra zeros, as you say, they're
Yeah,
increasing their access to goods to past us to a certain point. But past that point, they're spending less and less of that money on their own daily consumption. Once you get a certain level of rich, it's just like there's
yeah,
not those you don't consume
absolutely.
that many more goods. So that begins to taper off, and then yes, that kind of inequality between the consumption, I could imagine that getting addressed quite well by bringing up the consumers, bringing up consumer spending from the baseline with the basic income, and so access to real
Right.
goods will dramatically increase to people on the bottom. And if you were able to measure that, which is kind of hard because it's not the cash, right? It's the goods. That would look like it's inequality is reducing. But the income inequality, the amount of zeros that the rich people are collecting versus the person at the very bottom, that is, I think, would probably still increase even if you had a really, really high basic income because it's the tickets being collected, right? And it doesn't mean that the rich
Yeah,
person collecting it is spending them all on real stuff, but they are collecting a lot of money in their bank account. So I would just say the income inequality, I don't think that's as important as people think it is. What's much more important is this other form, right? The access. How do people on the bottom and the middle, like, can they actually get more stuff? And I think that
yeah,
could get risen to a level where it's very much similar to the level of access that rich people enjoy today. And in that world,
yeah,
it just doesn't bother me as much that there's some people collecting a lot of money. That seems less important to me in that world.
yeah. I do agree with what you just said. I do
Mm.
agree with that. And the way I see this is that, in fact, you have to look at what capitalists do, and as they, a large portion of their income goes to purchasing, uh, goes to being invested into productive capital. And you do need that in society. And to the degree that part of the problem is that productivity growth is moving all the income to into making it capital income because it's happening due to the building of machines and so forth. um so I agree that the access is what's important. And if you think about it, um you know access, like, if you think about the goods flow and the payments flow, there's sort of like, you could almost say that access to the goods is equivalent to ownership of the machine. And right now in the current framework, what's happening is that the wealthy are selling the goods to other people and getting income back. um, they don't actually use all of that income for their own consumption. um, and they put it back into more capital investment, and the capital investment is actually important. You have to have a balance of that. You do have to have the capital in society increasing in order to increase the prosperity in society. And I think this is a little bit of what the difference between not like current era, but like 20 years ago, like, or 30 years ago, like 1990s left versus right, what you're focusing on. And I think you need both. You do need the capital increasing, and you do need for society to become more prosperous. Um,
Yeah.
one one like sort of idealistic, like ideal thing is if everybody invests and everybody owns a certain amount of capital. That would also fix the situation. But to the degree that you can't necessarily like force people to do that, the basic income is a much cleaner and I think more effective and more realistic way to actually get what you want.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, even in that scenario, right? How we define what is productive capital versus idle or unproductive capital, right? Is what serves consumption. So even in this scenario where we have a lot more productive capital investors than we think we normally have, right? Like, you still need to ask the question: how is the consumption funded? Where is that coming from? And how do we know that that's being maximized proportionate to the real productive capital that we have? So I agree with a lot of everything you said, and I guess I think maybe for people that are concerned about the wealth being amassed by the capitalists and all these things. I mean, how you can model basic income, what you can think of that doing is you're ensuring that people who are making capital investments you're ensuring that what's profitable for them to do is to serve the interests of people, to serve the interests of consumers. You're going to restrain them more to getting their profit from serving that useful goal. Whereas when you don't have a basic income in place, it's you have a much larger arena of the economy that's going to be devoted to speculation and the stock market and all of this stuff that is not as directly related to the present day consumer, what they're spending on, what they're buying in stores.
Yeah.
So basic income is
And
about making the capital investment healthy as opposed to maybe the unhealthy amount of it that we have today.
yeah, absolutely. Another way to think about this question is that, on the one hand, you could think about, there is sort of like a limited amount of power in the world because not everybody can simultaneously decide, what's going to happen. Like, only one thing can happen in reality. And you can try to sort of take power away from the top, but I think the more effective thing that we should be doing is putting power at the bottom. So if you think about the bottom 50%, they're just struggling to survive. They don't have time, energy, or money to invest into, like reforming the government. And that is a huge problem. And if you put, basic income in so that people are not so, strapped by just surviving, then they actually have space to participate in, democracy, I guess, the way it should be happening. Yeah.
That's a point that I hear many basic income advocates bring up, that spending power will actually could potentially translate to societal power and political power. And yeah, I think that's a good point. You can't just take away power from people at the top. You have to give it at the bottom. And I don't really disagree with that assessment. I think that could be a very likely social outcome of the economic reform of basic income. All right, let me go to the next question. This one is field effect. This was posted in the other CMT Discord. You're increasing real income by an undetermined amount, possibly zero. That's what he's referring to calibration there, where with its sort of famous or infamous agnosticism, right, about how much basic income we can sustain. He says CMT also takes pains to point out people are doing useless make work. Who? Which people? What's the make work? Are we talking about the guy who gets paid to run the Pringles Twitter account? Yeah, okay, that's useless. But why would we assume UBI would get rid of that particular job? So he's responding to this CMT idea that because we're targeting full employment, we have a lot of unnecessary jobs. That's a phrase that Alex likes to use, similar to the David Graeber's idea, but not exactly the same of bullshit jobs, right? That's another way of putting it. People do, where we have people doing make work, unnecessary work, and Field Effect is saying that to him he can see some jobs that he thinks are useless, like this guy running the Pringles Twitter account. But how does he know? How do we know that when you put in a basic income, you're removing those jobs specifically? And my response to that would be to say that when we talk about unnecessary jobs, we're not talking about particular jobs that we look at and go, oh, that seems weird or distasteful or unnecessary. We shouldn't have it. We're stressing that the point of any job in abstract is to make stuff that consumers want. Now, if consumers want Pringles, and if there's money to be made by making more people aware that there's Pringles that they can buy, it's very well possible that the guy who runs the Twitter account maybe that's not an unnecessary job from the consumer perspective, from the consumer economy perspective. I'm not really willing to go and draw an X and say this job is not necessary or this job is necessary. The point is that if we're manipulating policy so that we're making it easier for all businesses to stay afloat in the absence of consumer spending, instead of maximizing consumer spending and making it harder for businesses to survive unless they're good at facilitating that, then we're sort of making all jobs a little bit unnecessary. We're sort of in general pushing the economy to generate unnecessary jobs, and most of those are going to be probably going to be service jobs. I would think primarily, because it's very easy to, you can always sort of come up with new stuff for people to do. You can monetize forms of human behavior that didn't need to be monetized before, to sort of create these excuses to get income to people. Whereas with goods, it's much more there's only so much, there's only so many workers you actually need to hire to produce 10 tons more stuff. So I we would just point out that, like, we're talking about the incentives of the entire economy. Are we incentivizing production, or are we incentivizing employment? Right now we're incentivizing employment, so who knows what jobs are actually necessary to support maximum production.
So I think this is a really great question. I have some things to say about this. I think that David Graeber, I think he approached it from more like sort of a sociological standpoint than an economic standpoint, and I think that he observed something, and I think the thing that he observed is true, that there's this sort of weird decaying of something about the job structure, that a lot of these jobs are somehow like useless, and people feel it when they're working these jobs. They're like, am I doing something worthwhile? I really don't think so. And I think that there are two things that would happen when you put in the basic income. So and one thing that would happen is that all this additional spending would drive up labor demand. And I think that when you drive up labor demand, that is going to, first of all, you get rid of unemployment, but as labor demand continues to rise after unemployment is down, then you will actually get the wages rising. And when the wages are rising, if you imagine that cashiers, they're, because there is more demand in the economy and it's easier to get a better job. Cashiers who are being paid $8 an hour, they will be starting to filter into the better jobs, and it will be hard to find cashiers that you can pay $8 an hour. Like the market rate will rise. Eventually, that gets to a point where McDonald's says, it's way too expensive to pay people to be cashiers for $20 an hour. It's way too expensive, and we're going to automate that. We're going to put in these kiosks so that customers can just order their own food, and you don't have to have people standing around getting a low wage and doing low value work. That's one effect, and the other effect, from a CCT view, is that part of the way the economy is that it is starved for demand. So if you think about an economy that is starved for demand, one of the things is that in that economy, it's very demand itself, consumer demand becomes very scarce. So in economics, when something is scarce, that tends to raise the price of it. And what is the price that's being raised? The things that's becoming scarce and becoming valuable in this sort of perverse economy is marketing, is becoming more valuable. So when demand is really scarce, then whoever can manage to like pry that last dollar out of the consumer's hand, that guy gets paid really well. So if you look at Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, and Google, probably Apple is the only company that does a lot of the value through creating a product. Facebook, Amazon, and Google, those are three enormous companies, and the only thing that they do is to grab attention. And Facebook is even in a sort of just like slightly dystopian way. Like, we're gonna do this thing so that everybody, we get lots of attention. People are on our website a lot, and that's enormously valuable in our current economy because they're able to generate clicks and able to generate they're able to pull just that little bit of consumer demand. And so as you put the basic income in and people are actually able to afford things, then consumer demand becomes less scarce and marketing actually becomes less valuable, because
Yeah,
people just have money to spend. So
that's a
that
good
so you
point.
don't have to bombard them to get it. So the Twitter Pringles guy, he may actually go away because the company may say, like, we don't need, you don't need to talk about Pringles on Twitter. Like, that's sort of useless. I mean, people just buy as many Pringles as they want, and you just focus on making good stuff, and people will buy it because they have money to do that.
I get what you're saying. I think that's potentially a good prediction. I think that could be the case, that when consumer spending is really scarce relative to the capacity potential that you have, there is a lot of money to be made out of wringing the last dollar out of particular people. Whereas once it's actually pretty easy to find customers, maybe firms will say, oh, well, we need to hire these marketing guys, but we don't have to pay them that much. I mean, people know our product is there, and they have the money to spend on it, right? That said, I think there will always be advertising, and so I'm very reluctant to say which are the specific jobs, because
Yeah,
we're not always good. Our intuitions about what seems like what seem like unnecessary jobs could be necessary, and what seem like necessary jobs actually might not be at all. So I tend to think about the fact that there's a lot of businesses today that make money, selling goods to consumers. Like this is what we would typically be saying are good jobs, necessary jobs. But let's say it's a convenience store that's on a road where everybody's driving to work, and they're driving to work at this giant, enormous telecommunication zombie firm, which we don't need at all, and is definitely gonna. We can actually just make everything more efficient by that's one company will do that instead of four, and we won't need to worry about it anymore. When that happens, everyone driving to work, well, they won't have to drive to work anymore because they'll have the basic income, and so those stores aren't necessary anymore. So I think Austin talks about this a lot, like the beer can effect, where when you have a lot of
yeah,
unnecessary jobs, you create a lot of seemingly necessary, unnecessary jobs on top of that. So I would just sort of emphasize that from a macroeconomics perspective, which is what's relevant to the basic income, you don't want policymakers going around and having opinions about which job is necessary, unnecessary. That's not really generally what they do. That's not what's related to basic income because it's about just funding the market in general in an efficient way. And so when that
yeah,
occurs, we'll naturally shed unnecessary work, unnecessary
yeah.
to maximize our general prosperity.
Yeah,
And
well,
yeah,
you
we don't have to
definitely,
be right about our. All I'm saying is we don't have to be right about our guesses about which jobs are necessary or not, because that would be like a command economy where we're picking jobs.
yeah,
Right.
and you don't want to do that. You don't want to have policymakers saying this which job is right or wrong. That's been tried, and it doesn't work, and you wouldn't think that it would work. But I think that the market actually takes care of that fine if you put the basic income in and make it healthy again. You do get that shift away from unnecessary like marketing, like we have to like scream at you constantly to get every last drop out, um, versus necessary work, which is making a really great product. And if you make a really great product and people actually have money to buy stuff, then that is where you would shift to. That would be successful for companies. That would create. Yeah, that would it would make it so that companies become more successful when they focus on making really great products, and then people will find out about the products, and if they have money, they'll buy it, and you don't have to market the heck out of everybody.
Yeah, I think we're most on the same page there. I think just the one thing I'll add is that I think people get what people miss about this point is that they're assuming already that we live in a consumer oriented economy, and people I think tend to associate waste with this kind of perceived overconsumption. And people are
Yeah,
sort of forgetting that what we've actually done, this when you look around at the economy we live in today, what that actually is it's a hyper employment oriented system. We've used policy and to actually incentivize busy work. Like that's literally the target. That's by definition you have to be doing that when you're saying that you're promising not to let employment fall below a certain level. If it does, then you use policy to juice the economy again and give everybody cheap loans and get everybody working again, right? So people just have not realized that that's what's going on, and I think that's what causes a little bit of trickiness on
yeah.
this question.
I think it's a little bit like the idiom of the slow boiled frog, where you put the frog in and you slowly raise the temperature, and they don't even realize what's happening. And I think that it is very natural for people to make the unexamined assumption. Like the default thinking is that the world sort of is the way it is, and that's sort of like how it has to be. And you really have to step back here and say, is this the economy really the only way the economy could be? And I think the answer is no. It's actually not the only way it could be, and it is actually, like in edge case, it's actually severely malformed
Yeah.
right now.
It could be that in the future people will look back and say this was
This
crazy.
is
Why did they
crazy.
do that? And I think
Yeah.
I would think that will be the case. All right,
Yeah.
let's do I think we have time for one. Let me do one more question. We'll have one more big response. Okay, so this one comes from Invalid Drop Table, and he says the implementation of UBI is one way. If it is overshot, we have no way of recovering. total economic collapse is likely. How does UBI guarantee automation investment instead of inflation or market volatility? So I think what Invalid is thinking about here is he has this idea that when you start giving people money, they're gonna start to sort of consume what's available, right?
Very
And if you
Austrian.
overdo this, people have this idea that it's this one way thing and it goes right to hyperinflation. It doesn't go back. So there's a couple different ways to answer this. I'm gonna first let's just start with his assumption and assume that UBI does cause some inflation, right? And I think an important thing to get about inflation is that, when you overshoot it a little bit, that's not an automatic signal of, an unstoppable problem. Like currently, quite famously, the Federal Reserve is going through a lot of effort to sort of assure people that inflation is going to be higher than it is right now. They're trying to get it up a little higher, and they're saying when it gets there, it's going to run a little bit over because we've been running under for so long. And so we can ride a little bit on either side of those. And it doesn't mean that once you're up there that you don't have a way of bringing it back. You do. We currently use monetary policy to do that. So depending on how the basic income is implemented, right? I mean, you could have a little bit of basic income and then we just keep reacting with monetary policy as needed. CMT, of course, is advocating for specifically calibrating the basic income so that there's no inflation. That's one of the primary things we're calibrating it to. So we're essentially promising with the basic income becomes a promise that we're going to be giving you this money, but we're not going to give you so much that we cause inflation or cause these other problems. So yeah, with those would be my sort of two answers to it. One, it's not the case that these things just sort of we can overconsume and never recover. It's normal for the economy to be sort of riding that line. That's what policymakers always have to do to make sure you have a stable currency. And the second part is that if you're really concerned about inflation and you want to make sure that money's being spent productively, then you calibrate the basic income. You just make sure that you're never paying, you're only paying out the amount of basic income that unlocks the amount of automation potential that you have, and never any more of that. That's an important promise to keep, in my view.
Yeah. So the CCT view is that 90% of economists and people who are thinking about economics fail to distinguish between two types of inflation, which are absolutely actually opposite from a CCT view. One type is capacity constrained inflation, and the other type is loss of faith inflation. And this guy sounds like he's from the Austrian uh, perspective, and he's concerned about the rising money supply and things like that. And what I would say to him is that if you look at capacity, we are actually way below capacity. We're not going to reach capacity. But the risk from inflation that does exist is due to the fact that the lack of consumer spending is causing all of the financial capital at the top to be frustrated. It doesn't have an outlet. It cannot be go into real investment and be turned into productive capacity. So instead, you get these enormous financial bubbles, which generate large unstable capital flows, and that is actually where the risk of inflation comes if one of those flows, kind of drives out of the currency. And the way to fix that, which most people would not realize, and most Austrian economists would not realize, is that you actually have to increase the spending. You actually have to put that money again from the CCT view at the bottom and not at the top because there's too much at the top. You need to put it in the bottom in order to drain the capital away from the top by putting it into real investment, and also so that you can allow the Federal Reserve to actually tighten the money supply away from their interest rate policy, let the interest rates rise without having the economy collapse, because you're holding up right now through those asset bubbles, and you have to stop doing that. You have to put the money at the bottom, and then you can withdraw it from the top, and it will also flow out of the top naturally by going into productive capital.
Now, there's a bit of a difference, I think, in our perspectives here. Largely, I agree with what you're saying. But for people listening who aren't familiar, I'm from a school of economic thought called CMT. Eddie's largely agrees, but has different ideas under a label he calls CCT. And I think one key thing that I think CMT would try to emphasize here is that when we talk about inflation, people talk about there being sort of multiple kinds of inflation, which is what you alluded to. And I agree with the part where you're saying that um, there's a difference between inflation that you would get where being you were at the maximum capacity of your economy and you'd exceeded that, and then another kind of inflation, which is, well, any other type of inflation besides that. Any time that there's inflation when you actually haven't maximized consumer spending compared to the consumer capacity that exists. And so, but there isn't. I wouldn't say that there's multiple kinds of inflation. Uh, I would rather say that inflation doesn't necessarily mean that you're at capacity. And inflation is really, as far as economists understand it, really refers to one thing and one thing only, which is um, a rise in the general price of consumer goods, right? So that's something that's either happening or it's not. Regardless of whether or not we set up the economy where it's benefiting people as much as possible, or whether we're sort of overstraining the economy by pumping money into it in an inefficient way as opposed to an efficient way. Um, the we can measure the inflation rate, and it's not measuring. Oh, I might have lost Eddie there. I don't know if he can still hear me, but I'll keep going for anyone who's on the stream. But inflation is not. Um, it's not measuring the price of assets. It's not measuring the price of financial instruments or anything going on in that side of the economy. And it's not measuring the price of input goods. It's only measuring the price of consumer goods, right? So when you hear that inflation is at 1.5% or 2%, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the consumer price index, or one of a number of different measures of this basket of consumer goods, and that's either rising or it's not. And you could have lots of different things happening with the financial sector, with the business sector. That's actually occurring right now. We've noticed that input prices are going up a lot. So raw or materials for food and other goods, those prices have increased a lot during the pandemic because of supply chain problems. But output prices for consumers remained actually very, very low, and there hasn't been inflation there, right? And so that's important. If input prices go up, then businesses are paying some more costs. Maybe they're making less profit, but that's okay if consumer output is rising and consumer prices are stable. I sort of like to emphasize how I think the contemporary economic system has inflation figured out pretty well. It's just not the case that if you've solved the inflation problem, that you've solved the capacity problem, or the benefit to people problem, right? Those are totally different issues. They're both important. We need to have a stable currency, but it doesn't mean that you're actually benefiting people as much as possible. So I think in the contemporary economics, we've lumped all these things together. We sort of assume that inflation and employment and consumer output are kind of all tied together. And Eddie is right to say that they're not, that these are different things. They need to be pulled apart separately. So that's it. That was sort of convenient timing for Eddie because it was we're wrapping up anyway. But thanks for listening. We only got a couple comments here, which was something about money equals awesome. So I don't know, not much of a question to respond to there. It's from Bot Studio, so maybe that's why. But thanks for watching. We'll be doing this again next Friday every week. So tune in, and if you have any questions, you can post them in the Discord here, in the CMT chat. If you have a question about CMT, if you have a question about the Money View, you could be the first one to post in the Money View chat, or in the general economics chat. You can post anything there, and I'll read it during the show. So thanks again, and I will catch you next time.
Take care.